When most people think of the samurai, they imagine honor, loyalty, and the shining edge of the katana, but there was another side to their world, one hidden beneath the ideals of bushido, a world of brutal punishments and merciless justice. The samurai were warriors, but they were also enforcers of order. And when that order was broken, the consequences were punishments so terrifying that few could endure them. These were not just acts of law. They were acts of control, designed to strike fear into anyone who dared to disobey. At the heart of samurai punishment lay the concept of loyalty. Loyalty to one's lord, to one's clan, to one's code. Betrayal was the ultimate crime, one that threatened the very foundation of feudal Japan. And so betrayal demanded the harshest consequences. For the samurai, justice was not blind. It was sharp, bloody, and public. One of the most infamous punishments in samurai culture was seppuku, ritual suicide. To the outside world, seppuku is often romanticized as a noble act of honor. But for many samurai, it was a sentence. Lords would command disgraced warriors to take their own lives, sparing them the humiliation of a common execution. The condemned would wash, dress in white robes, and compose a death poem, a final reflection of their spirit. Before witnesses, he would kneel, take his short blade, and drive it into his own abdomen, slicing across in an act of unimaginable pain. A second, often a trusted companion, stood behind with a katana, ready to sever the head and end the suffering. Seppuku was both punishment and performance, a grim spectacle that reminded all present that dishonor was worse than death. But seppuku was far from the only punishment. Crimes of lesser scale were met with equally harsh measures. Samurai were disciplined for drunkenness, gambling, insubordination, or cowardice. A warrior caught disrespecting his superiors could be stripped of his swords, a humiliation almost unbearable. To lose the right to wear the daisho, the paired swords that symbolized one's status, was to lose one's very identity. A samurai without his swords was a samurai in name only, shamed before his peers, his family, and his ancestors. Public shaming was a tool often used to enforce discipline. Samurai were paraded through the streets, their heads shaved, their armor stripped away. Crowds watched as once proud warriors were reduced to symbols of failure. This was not just punishment, it was deterrence. Every citizen who saw the fallen samurai was reminded of the price of disobedience. For men raised to believe honor was life itself, this public disgrace was a fate worse than death. For the gravest of crimes, executions awaited. Beheading was the most common method. Quick, efficient, and final, it carried with it the weight of dishonor. Unlike seppuku, which allowed a samurai to preserve dignity, beheading marked a man as disgraced. Heads of the executed were displayed at castle gates, mounted on boards or spikes, a gruesome warning to all who entered. These macabre trophies declared, this is what happens to traitors, rebels, and cowards. Yet some punishments went beyond even this. Crucifixion, known in Japan as haritsuke, was reserved for the most unforgivable crimes. The condemned were bound to a wooden cross, often pierced with spears, and left to die slowly in the elements. Death could take hours, even days. Sometimes fires were lit beneath them to hasten the agony. Crowds gathered to watch, for these executions were public events as much as punishments. Haritsuke was designed not just to kill, but to terrify. To see a man writhe and scream on the cross was to feel the weight of the law in one's very bones. Burning was another punishment that revealed the ruthless side of samurai justice. Criminals were tied to stakes, kindling piled high around them, and flames set alight. The smoke rose into the sky, carrying with it the screams of the condemned. This was not simply execution, it was erasure. Fire consumed not only the body but the very memory of rebellion. For the samurai, some crimes could only be cleansed by flames. Even boiling was not beyond use. In some cases, large cauldrons of water or oil were heated, and prisoners were lowered into them slowly, their bodies breaking under the unimaginable pain. Such punishments were rare, but their legend spread widely, magnified by rumor and fear. To imagine boiling alive was enough to keep many from straying against their lords. Exile, though less violent, was equally devastating. A samurai cast out from his clan became a ronin, a masterless wanderer. Without land, without pay, without purpose, many ronin fell into poverty, banditry, or mercenary work. Exile was a living death, stripping away everything that defined a warrior while leaving him to walk the earth in shame. Families of exiles carried the stigma for generations, for dishonor was not easily erased. Samurai punishments often extended beyond the individual. In a society where honor was collective, the crime of one man could doom his entire household. Families of traitors might be executed, their lands confiscated, their names erased from records. Wives and children were left destitute, sometimes forced to take their own lives to avoid shame. This collective punishment ensured loyalty, for no samurai could act without considering the fate of his bloodline. The Tokugawa shogunate, which ruled Japan from the early 1600s to the 1800s, formalized many of these punishments. Legal codes were written, courts established, but the brutality remained. Samurai were enforcers of this system, both feared and respected. They stood as examples of order, but also as reminders of what happened when order was broken. Even in peace, executions were carried out publicly. Samurai lined the streets, commoners crowded together, and the condemned faced their fate before hundreds of eyes. Heads rolled into baskets, bodies swung from crosses, flames devoured the guilty. These punishments were theater, meant to burn fear into memory. No one left such spectacles untouched. What made samurai punishments truly terrifying was the philosophy behind them. In the West, justice was often tied to law and crime. In samurai Japan, justice was tied to honor. A crime was not simply breaking a rule, it was disrupting the balance of loyalty, shame, and respect. Punishment was not just about the individual, it was about restoring harmony to the world. And if that meant cruelty, then cruelty was justice. The brutality of samurai justice did not always end with the condemned. Its shadow often fell upon the living long after the executions were done. Families bore the weight of shame. Entire villages were punished for harboring rebels. The message was simple and inescapable. Loyalty must be absolute, and disobedience would poison not only the guilty, but all who stood with him. One of the most haunting aspects of samurai punishment was its deep connection to spectacle. Punishments were not carried out in silence or secrecy. They were public, ritualized, and deliberately shocking. A samurai ordered to commit seppuku did so before witnesses. A criminal condemned to crucifixion died under the eyes of the community. The act was not only about justice but about imprinting terror into the minds of everyone present. The punishment was a lesson, and the audience was as important as the condemned. Over time, these spectacles became ingrained in the rhythm of life. In castle towns, executions were events, drawing crowds much like festivals. Children watched alongside elders, merchants paused their trade, and peasants traveled from nearby villages to see justice done. The horror bound the community together under the authority of the samurai. Justice was not only a law, but a performance, one meant to echo in memory and legend. Yet even in their cruelty, samurai punishments were bound by the code of bushido. Death was harsh, but it was also tied to ideas of honor, redemption, and cleansing. Seppuku was agony, yet it gave the condemned a chance to prove loyalty in death. Beheading was disgrace, but it was quick. Crucifixion and burning were merciless, yet they served as symbols of the order that bound society. To the samurai, punishment was not cruelty for its own sake. It was the necessary weight of justice. In the late Tokugawa era, As Japan slowly opened to the outside world, these brutal punishments began to face criticism. Western visitors recoiled at the public displays of cruelty. Intellectuals within Japan began to argue for reforms. By the time of the Meiji Restoration in the late 19th century, the samurai class itself was abolished, and with it, their harsh system of punishments faded into history. But the memory remained. Stories of seppuku, crucifixion, and public executions still echo in Japanese culture, reminders of a time when honor and loyalty demanded the ultimate price. Samurai punishments reveal the darker side of the warrior code. They show us a society where honor was survival, where justice was a blade, and where fear was a tool of power. For the samurai, there was no crime worse than betrayal, and no punishment too cruel if it preserved the order of the clan. These were not just rules, they were the foundations of their world. Today, when we imagine the samurai, we often see the shining katana and the noble warrior's stance. But hidden behind that image lies the memory of punishments so merciless that few would have survived them. They remind us that the samurai were not only warriors of honor, they were guardians of a system where loyalty was enforced with blood, shame, and fire. And though the samurai themselves are long gone, their punishments remain unforgettable. They tell us that power is never gentle, justice is never simple, and honor has always come with a price.